What would you do if your HOA decided to take over your garden and turn it into a parking lot, without asking for permission? Sounds ridiculous, right? But that's exactly what happened to me, though it started with something far less extreme, a simple fence. I had always thought of my property as my sanctuary. I worked hard for it, and I'd done everything by the book to make sure I followed all the rules. So, when I decided to put up a modest fence around my garden, I never expected it would lead to a war with the HOA. The idea was simple: I wanted some privacy, to mark the boundary of my space, and keep the neighborhood kids from trampling through my flowers. It wasn't a fortress or an eyesore, just a tasteful addition to my yard. But little did I know, that small act would send ripples through the entire neighborhood, and I was about to become the target of something much bigger than a backyard fence. It was an ordinary morning when the trouble began. I woke up early, brewed my coffee, and stepped outside to enjoy the quiet. The air was fresh, and the sun was just starting to warm the grass. I was in a good mood, ready to take on the day. That's when I noticed something off. There was a car parked right in front of my driveway, blocking it completely. It wasn't a random car, it was an HOA vehicle, and I could already feel the blood begin to boil. There was plenty of space on the other side of the street, so why park directly in front of my driveway? I walked up to the car, preparing to ask the driver to move, but as I got closer, I saw her. The woman inside didn't roll down her window or even offer a greeting. She just glared at me as if she were the one in charge here. And that's when the confrontation began, because this wasn't just about a parking space. It was about control, power, and the arrogance of Karen, the HOA board member who thought she could dictate what happened on my property. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the car in front of my driveway. I could feel the tension rising in my chest, the sudden change from a peaceful morning to an unsettling confrontation. The woman inside wasn't making any move to acknowledge me, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. I knocked on the window, trying to remain calm. She finally rolled it down, and without so much as a hello, she just stared at me with that look of superiority I had come to associate with people who thought they were above everyone else. I could feel the frustration building, but I took a deep breath before speaking. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my tone polite. "You're blocking my driveway. Could you move the car, please?" She didn't even flinch. "You can't have this," she said, pointing directly at my fence. "You need to take it down. Now." Her voice was sharp and commanding, as if she had the authority to control my property. I blinked, stunned. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to make sense of this sudden attack. "You heard me," she continued, without missing a beat. "Your lawn is now considered illegal. You violated HOA rules by putting up that fence. It's blocking the designated public access route, and you need to take it down immediately." I was speechless. How could this woman just show up out of nowhere and declare my property illegal? I hadn't heard a thing about public access or any issues with my fence before. It had been up for weeks, and nobody had said a word. I tried to process the absurdity of it, but the more I thought about it, the more my confusion turned to anger. I had followed every rule. I wasn't trying to cause trouble, and yet here I was, being told that my personal property was suddenly a public issue. "Wait," I said, trying to remain calm despite the growing frustration. "What do you mean by public access? This is my property. I have every right to decide what happens on it." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. "You don't understand," she said with a smug smile. "I'm on the HOA board. We've been using this space as a public access route for the neighborhood for years. You can't just decide to put up a fence and block it. You're disrupting the entire neighborhood." I felt my jaw tighten. There it was. The moment I realized this wasn't just about the fence. This was about power, control, and someone who thought they could dictate the way I lived just because they had some position on the HOA board. I stood there, trying to keep my voice steady, my blood beginning to simmer. "This is my land," I said firmly. "I paid for this property, and I put up that fence to protect it. It's not your business." Her expression shifted from smug superiority to open disdain. "You're making a huge mistake," she spat, her voice dripping with condescension. "You don't know what you're dealing with. I'll have the HOA involved. You'll regret this." Before I could respond, she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and began dialing. As she paced in front of me, muttering about compliance and how I was disrupting the neighborhood, I could feel my frustration turn to anger. I wasn't some naive homeowner who would just give in to intimidation. I had done my research. I knew my rights. The HOA couldn't dictate what I did on my property unless it was a legitimate public safety concern. And my fence wasn't blocking a road, it was just a fence. The more she ranted and threatened, the more I realized how out of touch Karen was with the reality of property ownership. She didn't care about fairness or rules, she only cared about her own sense of entitlement. I stood my ground, refusing to let her bully me into submission. When she finally hung up the phone, she shot me one last glare. "You're making a huge mistake," she repeated. "You'll regret this. The HOA will be involved, and you won't get away with it." I watched as she climbed into her car and drove off, her tires squealing as if she was leaving in a huff, convinced that her threats would have the desired effect. But instead of fear or anxiety, I felt a sense of resolve. She wasn't going to win. I knew my rights, and I wasn't going to let her or the HOA push me around. The thing is, I wasn't prepared for what came next. That encounter, as unnerving as it was just the beginning of something far bigger than I had anticipated. I thought I could handle it, but this wasn't just about a fence. This was about my right to live freely without someone from the HOA telling me what to do with my own property. Little did I know, Karen's actions would set off a chain of events that would force me to confront an entire system built on control and power. And I wasn't going to back down. After the encounter with Karen, I knew I couldn't just let it slide. I wasn't going to let someone bully me out of my property rights, especially not over something as trivial as a fence. I had always prided myself on following the rules, on doing things the right way. But Karen's attitude made it clear that wasn't enough. This wasn't just about one board member enforcing HOA regulations, it was about power, control, and manipulation. If I didn't act quickly, I could end up losing more than just my fence. I could lose the freedom to make decisions about my own home. The first step was obvious, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. I wasn't going to let Karen or the HOA push me around without knowing where I stood legally. I made a phone call to a lawyer who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. I needed someone who could explain the legal boundaries clearly and make sure I wasn't missing anything. The lawyer was reassuring. He explained that as long as I was within my property lines and following zoning laws, I was completely within my rights to put up the fence. There was no public easement or legal requirement for me to leave the land open for others to pass through. He also advised me to gather as much documentation as possible, property maps, neighborhood records, zoning laws. The more evidence I had, the stronger my case would be if it ever went to court. I was relieved, but I knew this was just the beginning. The lawyer warned that Karen and the HOA wouldn't back down easily. They had the power to make life difficult for me, and they wouldn't hesitate to use it. With this information, I felt more confident, but I also knew I needed to prepare for a fight. I started digging into everything I could about the HOA in my neighborhood. I checked the deed to my property, reread the zoning laws, and even looked into past disputes between the HOA and homeowners. The more I learned, the clearer it became, I was right. The HOA had no legal standing to demand that I remove my fence. But I also realized something else. The HOA was built on a system of fear and control. If I backed down now, I'd be letting them dictate what I could and couldn't do on my own land. I didn't want to live like that. So I took action. First, I installed signs on my property, clearly stating, "No trespassing." It wasn't just a statement, it was a firm boundary. I wanted to make it clear that my property was mine, and I was serious about protecting it. The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. Why should I have to take these extra steps just to protect my land? Why couldn't Karen and the HOA respect my right to privacy? I had done everything by the book, and yet I was being forced into a defensive position because of someone else's sense of entitlement. The next step was more significant. I hired a contractor to install a proper gate at the end of the driveway, making sure it was sturdy and locked. It wasn't just a fence anymore, it was a statement. A clear, unmistakable barrier that said, "This is my property, and you don't have a say in what happens here." The cost was higher than I had hoped, but I wasn't willing to back down. If the HOA wanted to fight me on this, I was going to make sure I had everything in place to protect myself. Days passed, and while the tension simmered, I couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't going to die down quietly. Karen was relentless, and I knew she would push this as far as she could. It wasn't just about the fence anymore, it was about her desire to control everything in the neighborhood. As I looked at the gate, standing strong at the end of my driveway, I realized I was preparing for more than just a property dispute, I was preparing for a battle of wills. I wasn't going to let Karen or the HOA intimidate me into giving up my rights. But I wasn't just preparing for them to show up at my door with more threats. I was preparing for the possibility of legal action. I kept everything documented, made copies of every letter, and photographed every corner of the property. If they were going to escalate this, I was ready. The lawyer had given me the tools to defend myself, but it would take more than legal knowledge. It would take strength and determination to stand up to an organization that thought they could control people's lives just because they had power on paper. I knew the HOA wouldn't back off easily. I had no doubt Karen would keep pushing, trying to get me to back down. But now, more than ever, I was ready. I wasn't going to let her, or anyone else, make me feel like my home was theirs to dictate. I was taking control of my property, and I wasn't giving it up without a fight. The tension built over the next few days like a storm gathering on the horizon. Karen wasn't done with me, not by a long shot. I had prepared myself for some kind of retaliation, but nothing could have fully prepared me for what happened next. I had been keeping an eye on my property, making sure everything was secure and that no one tried to trespass again, but I wasn't expecting the HOA to escalate things so quickly. I should have known better. This was Karen, after all. One morning, I walked out to check the mail, and there it was, an official letter from the HOA. I recognized the logo at the top, and my stomach sank. I had hoped that, after the last confrontation, things might settle down. I was wrong. The letter was formal, polite even, but the message was clear. We are writing to inform you that the HOA is demanding the immediate removal of the fence you have erected. This fence is in violation of several HOA rules, and failure to comply will result in fines and legal action. We ask that you open the access point that has been used by residents for years to avoid further disruptions. I couldn't believe it. They were still pushing the idea that I was violating some public access route, even though there was no legal easement or anything on record to support their claim. This wasn't about the fence anymore. This was about Karen, and the HOA's refusal to accept that I wasn't going to back down. They were trying to force me into submission with threats and intimidation. I knew I had to act quickly, but I also knew I had to keep my cool. If I let this escalate into a shouting match or a series of emotional outbursts, I'd be playing right into their hands. I called my lawyer again, this time with the letter in hand, and we discussed my next steps. The lawyer reassured me that I was still in the clear. I had every legal right to block access to my property, and the HOA had no case against me. But he warned that the HOA was relentless. If they were serious about pushing this, it would be a long road ahead. Days later, as I was finishing up some work in the home office, I heard the familiar sound of an engine pulling into the driveway. I looked out the window to see Karen's car parked in front of the new gate. My heart sank as I saw her get out of the car, clipboard in hand, a look of determination on her face. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. This wasn't just about a fence, it was a personal vendetta, and Karen was taking it to the next level. I walked outside, trying to remain calm. She didn't even wait for me to speak. "This isn't over," she said, her voice cold. "You're making a huge mistake by refusing to comply with the HOA's demands. You don't understand what you're up against." I had heard this before. But this time, there was something different in her tone. This wasn't just about her trying to make me feel guilty. This was her making good on her threats. "Karen, I've done my research," I said firmly. "I have every legal right to put up that fence, and I'm not removing it. I'm not going to back down just because the HOA doesn't like it." Her face twisted with anger. "You don't understand," she snapped. "The HOA will be taking legal action against you. You'll regret this. This could cost you more than you realize." I stood my ground, refusing to let her intimidation tactics affect me. "You can threaten me all you want, but you're not going to change my mind. I've followed every law, and I've done everything by the book. You don't have the authority to force me to remove my fence." Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed her phone, muttering about fines and compliance as she paced in front of me. I knew this was just another one of her tactics to try and pressure me into compliance. She was on a mission, and this was just the beginning. I had no doubt she was about to escalate things even further. Sure enough, after a few minutes, she hung up, her face red with frustration. "The HOA is going to take this to court," she said through gritted teeth. "You've made a big mistake, and you're going to regret it. We will make sure you're held accountable for this." She stormed off, slamming the door of her car as she sped away. I didn't feel fear. I felt anger. This wasn't just about a fence anymore, it was about Karen's complete disregard for anyone who didn't fall in line with her agenda. I had the law on my side, and I wasn't going to let her or anyone else use fear to control me. That evening, as I sat in front of my computer, I could feel the weight of everything building up. Karen's threats weren't going to stop until I fought back. I was no longer just defending a fence. I was standing up to a system that thought it could dictate how I lived my life. And I wasn't going to let them win. The following days were filled with a constant stream of letters and emails from the HOA, all pushing the same narrative: take down the fence, open up the access, or face escalating consequences. But I wasn't scared. I had done everything the right way, and I wasn't about to be bullied into submission. I was ready for whatever came next. If Karen and the HOA wanted a fight, they were going to get one. The tension finally came to a head at the HOA meeting. I'd spent days preparing for this moment, gathering every piece of evidence, every legal document, and every map that proved I was in the right. I wasn't just defending a fence anymore. This had become a battle for my rights as a property owner and a fight against the oppressive, self-serving actions of Karen and the HOA. As I walked into the conference room, I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The room was filled with HOA board members, all looking at me like I was the villain in some drama. At the head of the table sat Karen, smug and self-assured, clearly orchestrating the entire meeting. She was about to find out she'd underestimated me. The board president began the meeting with a brief summary of the issue at hand, the disputed fence and the supposed public access point. He glanced at me and said that several neighbors had raised concerns, so it was clear this matter needed to be addressed immediately. As soon as he finished, Karen shot a glare at me, clearly eager to speak. "This man," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "has caused chaos in this neighborhood. We've had access to that shortcut for years, and now we're all being inconvenienced because of his actions. He can't just block a road that's been used for so long. It's absurd. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. This is not a road, I said, my eyes meeting Karen's. It's a private access point, and I have every legal right to block it if I choose. You don't get to decide what I do on my property just because you think it's convenient for you. The room fell silent. You could see the other board members starting to shift uncomfortably. Karen was visibly flustered, her face reddening as she tried to regain control of the conversation. But it was clear, I wasn't backing down. You're making a huge mistake, she said, her voice rising in anger. I've been on this board for years. You don't understand what you're doing. The HOA will take legal action against you, and you'll regret this. I could feel her frustration mounting as she realized she was losing the room. But I wasn't intimidated. You may have been on this board for years, but that doesn't give you the right to dictate how I live my life. You've abused your position for too long. The HOA has no legal claim to my property, and I'm not removing my fence. There was a long pause. For the first time, Karen seemed unsure of herself. A board member who had remained silent up until that point spoke up, her voice tentative but firm. Are we sure this is within our jurisdiction? She asked, glancing around at the others. I mean, it's private property, right? Maybe we should reconsider how we're handling this. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The other board members exchanged looks, and I could see the uncertainty growing. Karen's grip on the situation was slipping. Karen, realizing she had lost her hold, slammed her hand on the table. This isn't over, she hissed. You'll regret this, mark my words. But it was too late. The board had begun to question her actions, and they saw her for what she really was, someone using her position for personal gain, someone willing to abuse her power to control others. The meeting ended with a quiet, uncertain agreement to drop the case and allow the fence to remain. The HOA backed off. Karen's threats fell flat, and the community, for the first time in a long while, began to see the truth. I didn't just win the right to keep my fence, I won the right to stand up against an unjust system. The victory wasn't just mine, it was for everyone who had ever been bullied by an HOA or felt like their voice didn't matter. Life slowly returned to normal. The HOA sent a final letter, apologizing for the way they handled the situation and confirming that I had the right to keep the fence. Karen was quietly advised to step down from her position on the board, a subtle but satisfying end to her reign of terror. I could finally relax and enjoy my property in peace, knowing that I hadn't let anyone intimidate me into giving up my rights. Looking back on it all, I realized how much I'd grown during this ordeal. It wasn't just about a fence, it was about standing up for what's right and not letting anyone push you around, no matter who they are or what position they hold. And it made me think, have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.